If you had walked through the streets of London in the summer of 1945, you would have seen flags hanging from windows and heard church bells ringing in celebration. The war was over. Germany was defeated. Britain stood on the winning side of the greatest conflict in human history. The photographs show smiling crowds packed into Trafalgar Square, waving Union Jacks and cheering until their voices were gone. But beneath the noise and the confetti, there was a silence that no one wanted to acknowledge. The silence of an empty treasury. Britain had won the war on the battlefield, but it had lost it on the balance sheet. The bombs had stopped falling, but the bills had only just begun to arrive. The country that once financed half the world now found itself begging quietly for time and credit. Not from enemies, but from allies. Not for weapons, but for food, fuel, and survival. To understand how the British Empire truly ended, we have to look past the maps and the armies and look at the ledger. We are often taught that empires die in battle. We are told they fall when barbarians storm the gates or when colonies rise up in armed rebellion. But the British Empire did not die by the sword. It died by the spreadsheet. It was dismantled not by revolutionaries, but by accountants in Washington and bankers in New York who understood a simple, terrifying truth. He who holds the debt owns the debtor. Before the war, Britain was the undisputed banker of the world. London was the heart of global finance. The sterling area was a vast economic ecosystem that covered a quarter of the globe. From Australia to India, from Egypt to South Africa, trade was conducted in British pounds. Money flowed into London from every corner of the empire, and from there, it was redistributed like blood through an imperial body. This financial dominance allowed Britain to punch well above its weight. It could fund a massive navy. It could project power into the Middle East and Asia. It could run trade deficits because the world always needed pounds. But the war changed everything. To fight the Nazi war machine, Britain had to spend money it did not have at a speed never seen before in human history. Factories ran day and night. Ships were built, destroyed, and built again. Entire cities were bombed and rebuilt while the war was still ongoing. The empire was mobilized not for profit, but for survival. And survival is expensive. By 1945, Britain owed more money than it had ever owed in its entire history. The debt was not abstract. It was real and crushing. Britain had sold its foreign assets to pay for weapons. It had liquidated investments in American railways and Argentine farms that had taken generations to build. It had stripped the gold from the Bank of England S-faults and shipped it across the Atlantic. But the most shocking financial maneuver of the war was not the borrowing from America. It was the borrowing from the empire itself. This is a chapter of history often omitted from the textbooks. It is known as the sterling balances. To fight the war in Asia and North Africa, Britain needed supplies. It needed uniforms, food, ammunition, and raw materials. A huge portion of this was sourced from India. But Britain did not have the money to pay India for these goods, so they devised a system that was effectively a massive forced loan. When a British commander in India bought supplies, he did not pay the Indian producer in gold or dollars. He paid in rupees. But where did those rupees come from? They were printed by the colonial government in Delhi. In exchange for printing these rupees, the British government in London deposited an IOU in a bank account in London. This account held the so-called sterling balances. On paper, India was getting rich. The balance in London grew to over £1.3 billion, a staggering sum equivalent to roughly $45 billion in today's money. But in reality, India was being robbed. The rupees flooding the Indian economy caused massive inflation. Prices skyrocketed. The poor in Bengal could no longer afford rice because the money supply had been inflated to fund the British war effort. This inflation was a direct cause of the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed millions. Britain was essentially fighting the war on a credit card issued in the name of its starving subjects. And the plan was simple. Britain would win the war and then somehow pay India back later, maybe. But the biggest creditor was not India. It was the United States. The relationship between Britain and America during the war was presented to the public as a partnership of equals. Two great English-speaking democracies standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. Churchill and Roosevelt were depicted as friends sharing a vision of freedom. But beneath the speeches and the photo opportunities, the balance of power had shifted permanently. America was the lender, Britain was the borrower, and borrowers do not write the rules. At the beginning of the war, Britain had paid America for weapons under a system known as cash and carry. Britain literally handed over gold and cash for every rifle and tank. When the cash ran out, Britain turned to Roosevelt with a simple problem. Without American support, Britain would lose the war. Roosevelt offered help, but it was not free. It came with conditions that would shape the post-war world. The solution was called Lend-Lease. On the surface, it sounded generous. America would lend Britain weapons, food, oil, and raw materials for the duration of the war. Britain would pay later or return the equipment. But the Americans inserted clauses into the Lend-Lease agreements that were designed to break the British Empire's economic monopoly. They demanded that Britain commit to dismantling the system of imperial preference. This was the trade system that favored goods from the empire over goods from the rest of the world. It was the economic glue that held the empire together. America wanted that glue dissolved. They wanted access to the markets of India and Africa and Australia. They wanted the British Empire to stop being a closed shop and start being an open market for American exports. Throughout the war, British economists like John Maynard Keynes fought a desperate rearguard action against American planners like Harry Dexter White. This battle came to a head at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Bretton Woods is famous for creating the IMF and the World Bank. But the real story of Bretton Woods is the defeat of Britain. Keynes arrived with a plan to save the British economy. He proposed a new global currency called the Bankor. It was designed to help debtor nations like Britain by penalizing creditor nations like America. It was a brilliant system that would have allowed Britain to recover gracefully. Harry Dexter White, the American negotiator, crushed it. He knew America held all the cards. He knew Britain was bankrupt. He insisted on a system built around the US dollar and gold, a system that favored the country with the money. Britain had no choice but to sign. They were signing their own warrant of execution as a global power. Then came the shock. When the war ended in 1945, Britain assumed that the Lend-Lease arrangement would continue for a period to allow recovery. The country was exhausted. Rationing was stricter after the war than during it. There was no bread. There was no coal. The housing stock was pulverized. But the moment Japan surrendered in August 1945, President Truman turned off the tap abruptly without warning. One day, supplies were flowing. The next day, they stopped. Ships already at sea carrying wheat and oil to Britain were ordered to turn around and come back to America unless Britain could pay in cash. Britain had no cash. It had no dollars. Its gold was gone. Its industry was exhausted. Britain had won the war and lost the peace in a single afternoon. With no choice left, the British government sent a delegation to Washington led by Keynes. They were not there to negotiate as equals. They were there to beg. Keynes hoped for a grant, a gift from one ally to another in recognition of Britain's sacrifice. The Americans said no, there would be no gift. There would only be a loan. And the loan would come with strings so tight they would strangle the British economy for decades. In 1946, Britain signed the Anglo-American Loan Agreement. They borrowed $3.75 billion. It was the largest loan America had ever issued, but the conditions were lethal. Condition 1, Britain had to pay interest. This shocked the British public, who thought they had fought a common war. Condition 2, Britain had to dismantle the sterling area. The Americans demanded that sterling become convertible. This meant that anyone holding British pounds, whether it was an Egyptian merchant or an Australian bank, could demand to exchange those pounds for US dollars. This was a trap. America knew that everyone in the world wanted dollars to buy American goods. Nobody wanted pounds to buy British goods because British industry was destroyed. If Britain made the pound convertible, everyone would sell their pounds and buy dollars. Britain's reserves would be drained instantly. Keynes warned against it. He said it was too soon. He said the British economy was too weak. But the Americans were adamant. They wanted the British market open. They wanted the empire's protective walls torn down. Britain signed. They took the money because they had to eat. The crisis arrived exactly as predicted. In 1947, Britain fulfilled its promise and made sterling convertible. The result was a financial massacre. Within weeks, countries across the world rushed to dump their British pounds and buy American dollars. Britain's foreign currency reserves drained at a terrifying speed. It was a run on the bank, but the bank was the United Kingdom. The government panicked. Convertibility was suspended after only 5 weeks, but the damage was done. The loan that was supposed to last for years had been burned through in months. Confidence in sterling was shattered. The illusion of British financial supremacy evaporated. From that moment on, Britain was no longer a global financial authority. It was a supplicant, a client state. Every policy decision made in London was now constrained by the need to defend the currency. Every government budget was haunted by the fear of capital flight. The empire itself was becoming too expensive to hold. Maintaining overseas bases, garrisons, and administrations required money Britain no longer had. The colonies were no longer assets. They were liabilities. India was the first to go, the jewel in the crown. Britain owed India billions in those sterling balances. It could not pay. It could not afford to govern. It could not afford to police the rising tensions. In 1947, Britain left India, not after a long transition, not after careful planning, but in haste. The decision was made quickly and executed badly. The result was partition, violence, and chaos. Britain did not leave as a confident imperial power reshaping the world. It left as a bankrupt landlord, fleeing a building he could no longer maintain. Other colonies followed. Palestine was abandoned to chaos. Burma was let go. Ceylon gained independence. Across Africa and Asia, the same pattern repeated. Britain did not fight to keep the empire because it could not afford the overhead. There were no glorious last stands. There was paperwork, timetables, withdrawals. This was not the fall of Rome. It was the liquidation of a failing business. By the end of the 1940s, Britain had stabilized, but at a lower level. It had accepted its status as a junior partner. But the humiliation was not over. The financial noose was still tightening. The pound was fixed at $4.30 before the war. It was a symbol of British strength. But in 1949, with the economy struggling and the dollar shortage acute, the British government was forced to do the unthinkable. They devalued the pound. Overnight, the value of the money in every British person's pocket dropped by 30% against the dollar. It was a public admission of failure. It was an admission that Britain could no longer compete. The exchange rate fell to $2.80. The 1940s ended with Britain victorious, but broken. The empire was dissolving. The currency was devalued. The debt was mountainous. But the political elite in London still believed in the illusion. They still believed that Britain could act as a great power. They still believed they could sit at the top table. They were wrong, and it would take a crisis in the Egyptian desert to prove it to them. As we end the first part of this deep dive, we leave Britain in a precarious position. It is 1950. The immediate danger of starvation has passed thanks to American loans, but the structural rot is deep. The country is living on credit. The empire is a ghost, and the United States is holding the mortgage. In the second part, we will see how the final pretensions of power were stripped away. We will see the disaster of Suez. We will see the lie of the pound in your pocket. And we will see the ultimate humiliation of 1976, when the mother of parliaments had to go cap in hand to the IMF. The 1950s were supposed to be the era of recovery. The Festival of Britain in 1951 showcased a nation looking forward to a future of jet engines, nuclear power, and modern architecture. There was a sense that the worst was over. Rationing was slowly being lifted. The new Queen Elizabeth II had ascended to the throne, promising a new Elizabethan age. But behind the pageantry, the financial rot was spreading. The British economy was suffering from a chronic disease known as stop-go. When the government tried to stimulate the economy to grow, imports would surge. Because British industry was uncompetitive, people bought German washing machines and American cars instead of British ones. This caused a balance of payments crisis. Money flowed out of the country. The pound weakened. To save the pound, the government would have to slam on the brakes, raising interest rates and cutting spending. The economy would stop. This cycle repeated itself over and over again. Britain could not grow without going broke. But the political class refused to accept the reality of their diminished status. They clung to the idea that Britain was still a superpower equal to the United States and the Soviet Union. This delusion crashed headfirst into reality in 1956 at the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was more than a waterway. It was the jugular vein of the empire. It connected Britain to the oil fields of the Middle East and the markets of Asia. When the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, nationalized the canal, Britain saw it as an act of theft and an existential threat. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, was a man of the old world. He believed that Britain could not allow a former colony to dictate terms. He conspired with France and Israel to launch a secret invasion. The plan was for Israel to attack Egypt across the Sinai and for Britain and France to intervene as peacekeepers, essentially seizing the canal back. Militarily, the operation was a success. British paratroopers dropped onto the canal zone. They secured the objectives. The Egyptian army was routed. From a military perspective, it was a textbook victory. But the battle was not decided on the sands of Egypt. It was decided in the trading rooms of New York and the Oval Office in Washington. President Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted. He saw the invasion as a relic of old-fashioned colonialism that would push the Arab world into the arms of the Soviet Union. He wanted the British out. He did not send the U.S. Navy to stop the British fleet. He used a weapon far more powerful. He attacked the pound. The United States Treasury began selling British pounds on the currency markets. The value of sterling began to plummet. At the same time, Britain needed to draw on emergency funds from the IMF to stabilize its currency. Eisenhower blocked the request. He told the British government bluntly that if they did not withdraw their troops, he would crash the British economy. Britain was days away from national bankruptcy. The gold reserves were hemorrhaging. The country literally could not afford to keep its troops in the field for another week without American financial support. Anthony Eden had no choice. He was humiliated. He ordered a ceasefire and a withdrawal. Suez was the moment the illusion died. It was the psychological turning point of the 20th century for Britain. The world saw that Britain could no longer act independently. Its military power was useless because it was funded by American credit. The empire had ended, not with a glorious last stand, but with a run on the currency. After Suez, Britain went into a period of introspection. The 60s were the era of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, of cultural revolution and swinging London. But economically, it was a decade of decline. The gap between Britain and its competitors in Europe widened. Germany and France were booming, growing at 5 or 6% a year. Britain sputtered along at 2%. The empire continued to dissolve. In 1960, Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, gave his famous Wind of Change speech in South Africa, acknowledging that the days of colonial rule were over. Colony after colony was granted independence. The Union Jack was lowered in Lagos and Nairobi and Kuala Lumpur. But the financial noose remained. The pound was fixed at $2 or cedi, a rate set in 1949. By the mid-60s, this rate was too high. British exports were too expensive. But defending this exchange rate became a matter of national pride. To devalue again was seen as a national defeat. The Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, elected in 1964, fought a 3-year battle to save the pound. He sacrificed everything to defend that $2.80 figure. He cut public spending. He froze wages. He canceled aircraft carrier projects. He taxed imports. He borrowed heavily from central banks. It was a war of attrition against the financial markets, and Wilson lost. In November 1967, the pressure became too great. Speculators were selling pounds by the billion. The reserves were empty. Wilson was forced to devalue the pound from $2.80 to $2.40. That evening, he appeared on television to explain the disaster to the British people. He looked tired. He tried to spin the defeat as a technical adjustment. And then he said the phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said, "It does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued." It was a lie, or at best, a delusion. Of course, the pound in the pocket was worth less. Britain imported half its food and most of its raw materials. The price of bread, tea, fuel, and clothes rose immediately. The standard of living fell. The British people realized that their leaders were not just powerless. They were dishonest about their powerlessness. The 1970s brought the final reckoning. It was a decade of chaos. The oil price shock of 1973 hit Britain harder than anyone else. Inflation soared to 25%. Unions demanded higher wages to keep up with prices. Strikes paralyzed the country. The lights went out. The garbage piled up. The dead went unburied. Britain was called the sick man of Europe. The government spent money it didn't have to prop up failing industries like British Leyland. They printed money to pay government wages. The deficit exploded. By 1976, the markets had seen enough. They stopped lending to Britain. The pound went into freefall, dropping below $2. For the first time in history, the government was running out of cash to pay its bills day to day. In September 1976, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Dennis Healey, was on his way to the airport to fly to a conference. He received a call. The markets were crashing. He turned the car around. Healey had to do the unthinkable. He had to apply to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. This was a humiliation without precedent. The IMF was designed to help developing nations. It was for struggling economies in Latin America or Asia. It was not for the United Kingdom, the victor of World War II, the former ruler of an empire. But Britain had no choice. A team of IMF inspectors arrived in London. They went through the books. They dictated terms. They demanded massive cuts in public spending. They demanded the sale of state assets. They demanded that Britain stop living a lie. Britain accepted the terms. They took the loan of $3.9 billion. It was the largest loan in IMF history. The 1976 crisis was the absolute nadir. It was the moment Britain finally accepted that it was just a normal country. The imperial pretensions were gone. The financial dominance was a distant memory. The country was broke and under the supervision of international accountants. But from the ashes of this disaster, a new Britain began to emerge. And this is the twist in the tale. The restrictions imposed by the IMF forced a change in thinking. The old model of state control and imperial preference was dead. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power with a radical new agenda. She did not try to rebuild the territorial empire. She understood that land was no longer the source of wealth. The source of wealth was capital. In 1986, her government unleashed the Big Bang. They deregulated the financial markets of London. They invited the American banks, the Japanese banks, and the European banks to come to London and do business with almost no restrictions. They transformed London from the capital of a British empire into the capital of a global financial empire, a dark offshore empire. Britain realized that if it couldn't rule the world with battleships, it could rule it with bank accounts. They created a network of tax havens in their remaining territories. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda. These tiny islands became the places where the world's corporations and oligarchs hid their money. And the web was centered on the city of London. So the story of how the U.S. bankrupted the British Empire ends with a strange irony. The United States stripped Britain of its colonies. It stripped Britain of its industry. It stripped Britain of its reserve currency status. It forced Britain to play by American rules. But Britain adapted. It became the service provider to the new American global order. It became the banker for the globalization that America created. The flags in Trafalgar Square in 1945 waved for a victory that was already hollow. The British people paid a terrible price for that victory. They paid with their savings. They paid with their empire. They paid with decades of austerity. They fought a war they could not afford to save a world that would no longer belong to them. Today, Britain is a wealthy nation again, but the wealth is different. It is not the wealth of production or of empire. It is the wealth of the middleman, the wealth of the dealmaker. The ghost of the empire still haunts the country. You see it in the architecture of London. You see it in the debates about Britain's place in the world. But the reality is found in the ledger. The British Empire didn't end with a bang. It ended with a loan agreement. It ended with a devalued currency. It ended with a fax from the IMF. And the lesson is one that every superpower should learn. You can have the strongest navy in the world. You can have the bravest soldiers. You can have the most righteous cause, but if you run out of money, you lose. The ledger always wins. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.